Excellent. Well, thank you, Jamie. A huge topic, and I think, and as the ambassador said, this topic is absolutely booming. And not only is it receiving more interest from, fans, regulators, sports bodies, but also I think by the general public. And I think that puts a particular onus on this intersection between private security, human rights and these mega sporting events. We have an absolutely superb panel. What I'm going to do is ask each of them to just introduce themselves briefly, but also to explain why this topic matters in their role and also why it matters to each of them personally. So, ladies first, Magali, if you wouldn't mind, what this means to you, your role, and why you think this is particularly important now. And then we'll have a question for the audience.
Well, lovely to be with you all this morning. So I am Magali Martovich, International Olympic Committee.
She wants you to put the thing.
Sorry, so how does it work technology-wise? We have to put that on, but that's for...
That's for translation and that's for speaking.
Yeah. Do you need a mic? So that's working? It's working. Yeah, apologies. So let's start again. So lovely to be with you all. I'm Magali Martovich, the head of human rights at the International Olympic Committee, the IOC. So the IOC, of course, is extremely well known for putting on the Olympic Games. We are also, of course, working with the International Federation and the 206 national Olympic committees to put those games on. The unit of human rights at the IOC sits in a corporate and sustainable development department. The objective of the unit is to develop and implement the strategic framework on human rights that the IOC has recently approved, in collaboration, of course, with all the different units internally within the IOC and, of course, with our external partners, the organizing committees, the international federations, and the national Olympic committees as its core. Prior to joining the IOC, I spent quite a lot of time working in the private sector, supporting large companies such as yours to implement human rights strategies and due diligence in their operations and supply chains. So I'm very familiar with the logistical challenges and complexity around governance, capacity building, education, and so on and so forth. Why does it matter to us? Well, the Games are probably one of the biggest platforms. We're not going to get into the detail if FIFA is bigger than the Games, but it's one of the biggest platforms in terms of the number of sports competition on the agenda and countries represented. So it has, of course, very clear link with private security during the Games for all the participants. Of course, the athletes are at the heart of it, but the spectators, the fans, the workers, the workforce, the media, everyone really surrounding the Games, so the host communities would have, a link, with, of course, the security and the safety of all participants. So it's absolutely core. We can't have a successful event if it's not safe. I'm really thrilled to be contributing to, making the sports world a safer and better place.
Excellent. Thanks, Magali. Let's turn to Michael, FIFPRO.
Thanks, Noah. Great to be here, everyone. I'm Michael Leahy. I'm a policy advisor at FIFPRO. For those of you who don't know, FIFPRO is the global representative body for professional footballers. So kind of like a global trade union for professional footballers. We represent over 65,000 players worldwide, men and women, an increasing number of professional women. And we work across the entire world of work of players. So that ranges from protecting players' human rights, advocating for social conditions, and advocating on different economic areas of the market that they can prosper in. So it's quite a wide-ranging area of work, and I think we'll talk a bit more about how that interacts with human rights and security today. But I think even over the weekend, there was a very prominent private security connection to the football industry and to the protection of players. I don't know if anyone saw the Raheem Sterling incident where he had to fly home from the World Cup, from the English team at the World Cup, as his house was broken into an armed robbery back at home. I think that gives a very prescient example of the connection between football players and private security and the importance and the impact that can have on their lives as professional players. The pinnacle of his career, the World Cup, he's had to fly home to deal with an issue. And I think as a result of the fellow England players have had to massively enhance their security throughout the rest of the tournament. That's an element maybe on pitch stadium security would what everyone would spring to mind straight away. But this is just a side issue of how there can be a strong connection to be built quite easily. But we'll talk a bit more about that later. Just before I pass on to Ronan, I think there's quite a strong connection, whether it's on pitch in the stadium, whether it's at the training ground, the hotel. I would just press all of the different types of interactions that can be had between football and private security. And I think we'll talk a bit more about those later.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks. I'm Ronan. I'm the Executive Director of Football Supporters Europe. We are the representative body for football fans in the UEFA region, with members in roughly 50 nations in the UEFA region. We work on a broad range of topics, from ticket prices, kick-off time, to probably the most pressing of all, safety and security in the stadium, with a focus on mega sporting events and international games such as the UEFA club competitions. Why does it matter for us to be here? In the 14 years of our existence, we worked a lot with the police, and that's where we focused our action when it came to ensuring safety and security of fans and ensuring that our fundamental rights are guaranteed and protected at football. But we felt more and more the need to build a relation with the private security sector. I think this need became more obvious throughout COVID and after COVID, when we saw the major changes in the sector, when we saw major turnover in the stewards that we were used to work with in our respective clubs. As fans, we need to fight the representation of the stewards being an enemy in the stadium, someone that imposes rules on us, but rather build the perception of stewards being our partners. We are in a specific positions because we represent what we hope are partners for private security sectors. We're also often victims of bad safety and security setup processes, protocols. And we also represent perpetrators, people who jump on the pitch or behave illegally in the stadium. So we are at the crossroad of all of this behavior in the stadium. So we're very happy to be here, and we hope that's a first step in building a closer relationship with the private security sector.
Fantastic. Thanks. Remy?
Good morning, everyone. Can we talk about Swiss federal elections? Well, it still hurts a little, but I'm nevertheless very happy to be here with all of you. I'm happy to see old and new friends to talk about private security, sport, and human rights. There's an ellipse in the title, ellipses, because human rights is really part of our discussion today, and I'm very happy to be able to provide some perspective from the Swiss government. My name is Remy Friedman. I've been working on business and human rights for the last little bit more than 10 years for the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. I've been accompanying and witnessing how two very important initiatives grew up from almost the beginning, the International Code of Conduct Association, of course, and the Center for Sport and Human Rights, and I'm very happy that both of them are really meeting today, and that we can have a discussion about the relation between sport and responsible provision of private security and respect for human rights in sport, of course. From a government's perspective, it's very interesting to see how these two initiatives that are the result of a multi-stakeholder dialogue very well align with the Swiss approach in promoting very pragmatic, concrete solutions to very acute and severe and important human rights issues and problems. We have done so through supporting the development of the Code of Conduct, and then the very concrete result of having an oversight mechanism through the ICoCA with its specific governance. As the host state of a number of international sports federations, we contributed from the very beginning to the multi-stakeholder dialogue that led to the creation of the Center for Sport and Human Rights. All of these processes are associated with a particular town on the Lake of Geneva. I mean, we have Montreux, Nyon, we have Glion, that gave birth to the first, where the first dialogues were hosted. So I will be glad to offer a perspective during the discussion on how these two initiatives very well align with UN guiding principles on business human rights, with our National Action Plan on business human rights, and how, after having identified very specific human rights risks, we have seen stakeholders coming together, having a dialogue. We had back at the beginning of the early 2000s, the Niso Square incidents in Baghdad that gave birth to the whole realization that legal frameworks were not necessarily sufficient to address human rights risk related and international human rights law risk related to private security companies. So that we had the Montreux document process, as you all know, and then the ICoCA. Back in 2014, 2015, we had the issues related to mega sporting events that really came to the fore with, well, the realization of the importance of workers' rights with respect to the attribution of the World Cup to Qatar, the eviction of communities related to the Rio Games. So different stakeholders and groups of interest coming together. So I'm happy to offer that perspective in the discussion later on.
Fantastic. Guido?
Thank you. Thank you, Nuala. Thank you for the invitation. Pleasure, privilege to be part of this panel. I'm Guido Battaglia. I'm the head of policy and outreach with the Center for Sport and Human Rights. In my previous steps, I worked with other sectors such as mining, infrastructure, commodities trading, and I work with multiple organizations to advance responsible business practices, and have been working with the center now for 5 years. The center is indeed the outcome of a process, of a dialogue that brought together governments, representatives from civil society, trade unions, sport organizations, sponsors, broadcasters, and all the other actors involved in the sport ecosystem. And the task, the mission that the center is here to accomplish is to promote respect for human rights in the world of sport. And we do it in 3 different ways. The first step that we take with all actors is to work together to raise awareness, work together to understand where the risks are, what are the issues, and this is one of the reasons why it is so important to talk about the role of private security. And when awareness is generated, when the issues are clear, the actors involved are clear, then it's easier for all organizations involved to develop skills, build their capacity, and work together with all actors to identify solutions to address this issue. And the ultimate goal is, of course, to add value, to leverage human rights, responsible business conduct, to promote a world of sport that fully respects human rights and can act as an example for all the sectors and really generate best practices and good behavior around the sector. Some examples of our work, we have been mapping the life cycle of mega sporting events for 5-6 years now, and at each stage of the life cycle of mega sporting events, there are human rights risks, and the work is continuing. It's an ongoing basis. I just came back from Doha, from Qatar, where I was part of the team that worked with FIFA to conduct live human rights due diligence on risks linked to the organization of mega sporting events. And we, of course, identified many challenges, and we will report back on the challenges, on the best practices, and on recommendations on the way forward to address these issues. And yes, some of them are linked, of course, to private security. And it is very important to work all together to address them. Another example is a guidance that we developed with Football Supporters Europe and with fans to understand what are the risks at the last mile. So when drop off from transportation to the venue of the event, what can happen, what can go wrong, and how can fans be supported to avoid any potential negative impact.
Fantastic. And just before we move on to the audience question, maybe just in terms of my own background, I am a behavioural scientist, which means I advise companies, including sports institutions and major multinationals, on changing behaviour, culture change, decision science, etc. My formal background is 3 decades in investments, financial services, and I've also worked extensively with a number of UN bodies, UN Women in particular, and I sit on a number of different sports boards as well. But about you now, I'd like to ask a question just by a show of hands before I start with Guido for his views. What is your view in terms of where the private security industry is now? So we know there's more work to do, but would you, so just being very binary, would you rate the industry in terms of effectiveness as being good with more to do, or, so they're your choices, or poor with more to do? So those people who think we're doing quite a good job in terms of private security in sports, do you think it's kind of good, even though there's more to do? Raise your hands, and then by definition, whoever doesn't raise their hands, it means that you think we're doing a poor job. And then I'll ask Guido to give his view on how you think we're doing. So just to help Guido, so those who thinks we're doing quite a good job? I hope you're all not from ICoCA. Okay, so by definition, there are always some abstainers. Those who think we're doing a poor job. I say we, the collective we. Well, that's only about 6 votes overall, 3 and 3. Yeah, okay, so mixed. So you've got people who aren't sure yet, which means Guido's going to persuade you either way, and we can take a vote at the end. So Guido, how would you say, so you just mentioned that you're obviously at the World Cup and there are lots of challenges, as we know, but how do you think, and then the audience or the rest of the panel, any other views, how do you think private security is doing in terms of sports?
I would say that private security, like many other actors, are approaching the topic of sport and human rights and are getting more familiar and developing a better understanding of the issues at stake. We have been working on mapping risks linked to the life cycle of mega sporting events, but another thing we have been doing is mapping the actors in the sport ecosystem. And as I told you, I come also from other sectors, and what I've noticed in the world of sport is that some key principles, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, are now being explored, better understood, and implemented. The IOC has a human rights policy, a human rights strategy, FIFA the same, and there is more and more understanding of the issues at stake, and this is also because of the work of representatives of fans, representative of players, NGOs, and all the work, for example, that they have been doing in Qatar when it comes to the rights of migrant workers. So I think that the work of private security fits well in this overall process to better understand the issues at stake. My colleague David Gravenberg participated in a session 6 months ago. He identified 4 key actors when it comes to ensuring safety and protection on mega sporting events: the military, the police, stewards, volunteers. We may agree, welcome your thoughts on that private security probably fits within stewards and police. They're somewhere there. It depends on each event how private security will be deployed. It depends what the role will be, and one key element linked to how private security operates and behaves is how much they're trained, how much they know about the situation, and as of when they have been informed of the situation. So I would say that it is really part of a process to better understand these dynamics. If I conduct research online, I don't see much research, much knowledge on the topic. And this is also a great opportunity for all of us, I think, to further explore and better understand where the risks are and how can all the actors work together so that private security companies can have really a positive and constructive impact when it comes to the delivery of mega sporting events.
That's a great point. Research, always topical. But you're right, there isn't a lot, there isn't enough, and it is a great opportunity, and maybe we'll touch on that near the end in terms of what can be done. Remy, you've been around a while, as it were, working with ICoCA, and there are a couple of more mics there, just if anyone wants to share the mics. What has surprised you the most? So Guido sees it as directionally positive. I think, What have you seen over the last while? Because you have been around since inception of ICoCA, but what are the major shifts, positive or negative, that you've seen?
Well, thank you. I think in your question you were talking about decades, which doesn't feel one much younger. But if I go back 3 decades, I can see that what has changed is the awareness, the realization, and the understanding that leverage that there needs to be a leverage from clients. Back 3 decades ago, I was in Somalia, delivering humanitarian aid. We were protecting by local private security, and I remember there was no human rights due diligence whatsoever, and I'm not sure what age our guards were, but our goal was to deliver aid to the most needy. So a few things have changed in between. If you take a giant leap passing the creation of ICoCA and implementation of the Code of Conduct, and we talk about sport, what I've seen is that there is a realization now from different actors that there is a leverage that needs to be exerted by clients, by the different actors, and that all sectors are connected. We didn't think about sport when we were addressing complex environments at the beginning with respect to the Montreal Document and ICoCA, and private security was not necessarily at the center of concern when the first discussions took place on sport and human rights. But now I can see with respect to Qatar that national football associations are looking at how hotels where the teams are being hosted are what kind of companies they are hiring, and how the employees are being treated, and they have made their decisions where to host their national team based on these criteria. FIFA, as Guido also mentioned, has integrated ICoCA as a possible precondition for contracting private security services in their World Cup Qatar sustainability strategy. So there is this realization that everything is being connected. So, well, we can talk about the hospitality sector. We talked about stadium. We talked about the perimeter of the World Cup and the treatment of supporters, of course. There's a treatment of employees as well. But this is a clear realization that there is leverage from clients, as you all know, with respect to the Code of Conduct, but from other clients, from other actors, other stakeholders, and they all have an influence. So I would see this as a positive shift. And it will help also in mapping out much better the relation between the different stakeholders and actors.
Fabulous. I'd like to shift now to more broadly. Magali, you mentioned the Olympics was obviously the biggest, no competition, but the biggest event with the most number of games and countries. So I think let's go broad to you, and then maybe we'll go to Michael and Remy to talk about football in particular. But from your perspective, you also mentioned the framework, which is obviously huge and going to make a huge difference. Can you talk to us about the origins, the challenges, and maybe the measures in terms of how that came about and how it matters now and what you're going to do about it, as it were?
Yeah, for sure. So the IOC has been working on human rights-related topic actually for many, many years, even though those topics were not called, human rights.
Good point.
In different ways, if you think of the programs that the IOC has around the safety of athletes, the promotion, of course, of gender equality, of course, the different edition of the games that started themselves to look into those topics and so on and so forth. What this framework really does is it brings all those different initiatives in a coherent frame. And it does 3 key things. The first thing, it aligns the IOC with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And that's quite a big milestone in the world of sport. As Remy mentioned, the world of sport is slowly aligning with the GPs. FIFA already had done, its own strategy. The IOC now is coming to it, realizing actually the usefulness and the relevance of the guiding principles, even though we are technically not a business. We are an international non-governmental organization. The standard of the GPs are so powerful in the way that it gives a methodology to try and manage those impacts on people in a way that is absolutely recognized, legitimate, and very, very clear. So it aligns us with that standard. So it's a big, big step forward in terms of really signaling to the whole sports governing bodies that they have themselves to look into that as well. So that's the first thing the framework does. The second thing the framework does is it clarifies where the IOC is going to really respect human rights. Very often the IOC, because of its big presence, is often called to take on stance on many different topics. What this framework does is it clearly defines the three spheres of responsibilities of the IOCs. First, as an organization, so the way we take our decisions, the way we, organize the workforce, our own internal activities, if you want. That's the first sphere of responsibility. The second one being, of course, the games, both in the selection of the hosts and then in the delivery of the Olympic Games. And then the Olympic movement. As I said, we are working with, of course, the international federations that come to the game through all our 206 national Olympic committees. So this is what the second point of the framework does. It really clarifies the perimeter of actions. And within those perimeter, which are quite broad, we will promote respect for human rights, of course, in accordance with the UNGPs. The third thing the strategic framework does, it sets, of course, strategic intent and clear actions and objectives for the coming years. When it comes to the games, which is where I think there's more relevance for the topic of this panel today, as I said, it's really about driving best practice when it comes to human rights, both in the selection of the games and in the delivery of the event. The event lasts 7 years. From the time the Olympic committees, awards the games to when they are delivered. As Guido said, during that life cycles, there are many, many, many human rights, issues or things that could go wrong, or indeed opportunities, right? That we could look at saying, well, we could really work on that in advance and, push for progress within, again, the activities that are linked to the organization and the delivery of the games. What we've done as well for our games, we've identified a series of populations that tend to be impacted by the organization of the games. Of course, the athletes, they're at the heart of the sporting competition. So they are the key, if you want, actors. They're under the spotlight. There's, of course, the workforce, including, of course, the volunteers, the games delegations, all the technical officials that gravitate around the athletes. We have the workers, contract workers, workers in supply chain, on the construction sites, in the hospitality, and so on and so forth. And then we have a big impact on what we've called communities at large, whether they're the media, the fans and the public, the spectators, and of course the host communities. And throughout that, there are definitely issues, of course, with non-discrimination, equality, not treating different people differently. The games welcome the world, We have a huge crowd of people coming from everywhere, whether they are, of course, from the athletes and the sporting world or the fans coming from all over the world. How can we ensure there's no discrimination, that everyone is treated fairly? The second thing that we look at, of course, is the safety of everyone involved. Here, of course, is a very direct link, but also in the first one when it comes to private security. And so on and so forth. So we are in that process of first identifying and better understanding the risk. As Guido said, it's a journey, and there were very obvious risks that were very well known for many, many years and very well accepted. But there are others, right? And when we start applying really the UNGPs, when we look really where we are involved, it has a broad reach. What is the leverage that we can exercise, indeed, with our private forces that the organizing committee, would contract, or indeed through the hotels, or indeed through all of this other, cascading down. And what can we do to do that? So we are very much in that process of mapping, but also codifying our expectations on what to expect. So I think we're going to be busy in the coming years.
I think you are. And you mentioned just there the codifying of expectations. Have you at this stage wrapped into that sanctions or, consequences, deterrents for non-compliance with human rights?
Through our
in the framework.
Committees.
Yeah.
And it's linked directly, of course, to the governance of the games. What we have been doing at the moment is very much first integrating in the host contract all the human rights obligation that starts to be effective as of the Paris 2024 Games, which were awarded, of course, many years ago. And there will be the first edition of the Games where those human rights obligations are made very explicit. And there are, of course, all the due diligence behind that in terms of the constant engagement that the IOC does with the organizing committee throughout the life cycles to understand if, those obligations are met in practice and what does that mean. Now, what we're going to be doing with the framework is provide a much more level of granularity and expectation when it comes to those different populations that I have just mentioned, and be much more specific with those focus areas that we've identified: equality, non-discrimination, safety, and we have 3 more around livelihoods, voice, which includes freedom of expression, the grievance mechanism, all the reporting, the accountability, and the privacy of everyone. And that, again, is very, very closely linked with the work of the private, security staff.
Fantastic. Huge amount on your plate. But as you say, you've got the most games to choose from. Ronan and Michael, you clearly focus exclusively on football. To what extent, and Michael, seeing as how you have the mic, you can go first. To what extent you both have one? What a competition. Who will we start with? To what extent do you look outside your own world? And we're all prone to just looking into whatever domain we're in. That's human nature. But what lessons do you learn, can you learn, from looking at some of these other areas, whether it's, and I randomly pick rugby, tennis, golf, boxing, anything, basketball. What can you look at where human rights and private security is being done well? Sometimes it's easier when it's not a big mega sporting event like football, but sometimes you can learn lessons from these smaller sports. What's your experience, Michael? Anything that you've been picking up at FIFPRO?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot. I think as we're an advocacy body on the human rights of professional players, I think it'd be a bit hypocritical of us not to also expect human rights to be respected in other industries. I think our World Cup partnership, we decided to do a partnership with BWI, which would be the Building and Woodworkers Institute, which would be a global representative body for building woodworkers. And they are very active in Qatar in terms of migrant workers who are building stadiums and building infrastructure. And we chose that as a way we could make an impact in Qatar. Initially there was talks of boycotting and things like that. We decided to help BWI in terms of helping to get rid of things like the kafala system or reduce negative impacts that migrant workers are affected by in Qatar. But then, learning from other industries and other sporting organisations, I think the safety officer role is a big thing. The safety officer role at different organisations, whether it's sporting or outside of sport, is very significant. It has that crossover, I know, with the people Ronan represents in terms of the fans and also the players. It's a crucial role. I think there's been a couple of high-profile incidents in the last 12 months or so that have highlighted that expertly. In Paris for the Champions League final in May or June, I think there was documented trouble where even the supporters were actually blamed for the issues, when in reality I don't think it was that. I think the competition organisers, even in the football being probably the biggest sport in the world, can learn a lot from the way, as you say, rugby can do it or other sports have done it. I think there is a little bit of a differentiation in terms of football needs to be treated a bit differently. I think the variance of supporters and the variance of the type of people who go to football, just given its popularity, means it has to be treated a little differently. But I think there's definitely things that can be learned from other sports.
Terrific. And Ronan, football fans have a certain image. Your responsibility is, of course, in that supporter zone. What can you learn from other events, and what I mean, whether it's technology, and we can touch on technology later, but what are you picking up from other organisations or sports in general that you can bring back into your world?
I think our role in this discussion is that we represent the most structured fan base. There's no equivalent to how the European football fan culture is structured. So this is the role we play in this discussion, and obviously just like FIFPRO and other unions, this is also about playing a role in setting up standards that can benefit to any fan at any sporting event. Now, when it comes to other industries, I think the problem in football and its sporting events in general is that the way we are hosted is seen too much from a security perspective, not enough from a safety perspective, and not at all from the service perspective. If you go to the cinema, if you go to a mall, if you go to the theater, if you go to a concert, you will expect to have access to drinkable water and clean toilets. That's a reasonable expectation. When you go to a football game, not so much. When you go as an away fan to a football game, you will most likely don't have access to food, to drinkable water, and to clean toilets. So, you know, that's the biggest sport in the world. And still, we are treated too often like animals. We're a captive audience. We will come no matter what. That's the problem. No matter how badly we are treated at the body searches, by the police on the way to the stadium, no matter how poor the services are, it's not a rational relationship to the sport. We will come no matter what. So too many stakeholders in the game, clubs, competitions organizers, will try to save as much money as possible on the service sides of things and focus exclusively on safety and security. Now, most countries now in the Council of Europe region have signed the Saint Denis Convention on safety, security, and services. This only works if you apply the 3 pillars in parallel. Because by hosting people properly, you will make a safer event. You will, by creating rules that are clear for everyone, then the only trouble is being created by fans or by people who decide to cross the red line. And the problem is when rules are not clearly established. And Guido was talking about the World Cup. I'm just back from Doha as well. That's one of the main problems with this World Cup is that there are the rules dictated by the organizers, and then there's a very different experience on the ground. Our role as a fan organization is to lobby, advocate for the rainbow flag to be allowed in the stadium. But then when the competition starts, whether it is yes or no, there needs to be a clear rule. Is it allowed or not inside the stadium? And unfortunately, at the World Cup, there is the public narrative of FIFA, which is the rainbow flag is allowed, and then there is what we see on the ground that is not. And this is putting fans at risk.
That's a great point. And let's just jump to Guido. You know, the rainbow reversal was one thing, but you're on the ground. To what extent do you think this focus on human rights how was your experience of it, and has it accelerated post-pandemic, or do you think the pandemic has made no difference at all? Because given the pandemic has this, has shifted people's mindsets, how people think, and, there's a humanisation, a greater humanisation. Do you think that has helped your cause, and has it made any difference on the ground? Because, as Ronan says, they're shocking conditions.
Does it work? Yes.
Yes.
I will split the question into
that's
two.
Right, that's two.
Yeah. But regarding the experience, as Ronan mentioned, clearly what we could observe is that there are challenges in the implementation of certain rules, challenges linked to accessibility, challenges linked to discrimination, to harassment. But we're also seeing that many fans are also having a positive experience. So I think that we will take stock of all the information we have been gathering, and we will report about this.
Yeah.
And clearly, the landscape is mixed. One great success from our side is that we were in a position to bear witness, to see what is happening, and to identify challenges that we hope can really help move the agenda forward. This is a very, very important step. The work that FSC, that FIFPRO is doing is really paramount and is at the core also of the mission of the center, because it is only through engagement, through mutual understanding of the issues at stake and getting the perspective of the affected people and those who are at risk that progress can be made and discussions can advance. So this is the first aspect. When it comes to the pandemic, I think that probably Michael and Ronan are better positioned to answer that. But what we saw is that there was an increased understanding of how access to sport is limited for many people. When we saw that we were all stuck, that we could not do sport and we could not attend sport events, what we saw is that there was an increased acknowledgement of the challenges that specific groups and specific vulnerable people have to access to sport. So I think that there are many lessons that can be drawn from the pandemic. One key word that was repeated very often was build back better. And I think that this is definitely the key lesson that we can take from it. And it is through communication, through engagement, through sharing of experiences that we can really understand what was the impact of the pandemic and how things have changed and how can we advance together.
Okay, great. Let's invite Remy in on that exact point. Build back better, Remy. In terms of governance of these huge events that we've just heard about, do you think enough is being done at a governance level? And I know we could have a whole day on the word governance, but you know, from a summary perspective, do you think enough has been done, and what would you point to as the either quick wins, if there's such a thing in governance, or areas that you know we could focus on?
Well, thank you for the question. I wouldn't be in a position now to express an opinion on the governance of organizations, for example, that deliver the mega sporting events, or of the private security companies. But what I would do is a little bit say that if we don't come together, as Guido just said, we're not enabled to exert an efficient governance of complex issues that need to be addressed together in a collaborative and collective way. So this has been the realization aligned on the UN guiding principles that multi-stakeholder engagement was a mean to the end of promoting human rights due diligence. For the Code of Conduct for Private Security Service Providers, we had private security companies, clients, governments, civil society coming together, then negotiating the Code of Conduct, developing a governance mechanism, an oversight and governance mechanism through the International Code of Conduct Association. With respect to sports, of course, the different actors have realized and have undertaken a number of important steps to actually provide events, for example, that have a social legitimacy, a social license to operate like. This is what we aim for also in the different sectors. But you have to bring in different perspectives, different angles. So for sport, we had international sports federations, athletes, supporters, sponsors, governments, international organizations, broadcasters coming together with these different angles. And as you negotiated the Code of Conduct for Private Security Service Providers, there was a collective engagement that crystallized through the sporting chance principles around which all these actors gathered and decided to create this center that would then provide services, know-how, and be a little bit of a safe space to discuss all these issues and look for efficient solutions. So in terms of governance, there is still a lot to do, of course, of these multi-stakeholder initiatives. I see similarities between also these two initiatives in terms of the internal, I would say, challenges of a multi-stakeholder governance, where you have, a CEO that has to deal with boards and members, for example. The fact that nothing is that clear-cut and that you don't necessarily always in the position to show the concrete results, but there is process. There are some of the quick wins that have been mentioned before. So it's a journey, as it was mentioned by people on this panel before.
Excellent. I should say we will have time for questions from the audience, so gather your questions. But first, maybe as you're thinking about what you want to ask, governance is one thing. Obviously, technology is something else. Whether it's managing fans or, Magali, you're looking at the IOC and managing the games. Huge advances in a lot of fan safety sort of technology, crowd emotion, etc. Let's start with you, Magali. What, if any? It's a hard one, technology, because where do you start? It's here to here in terms. But are there any areas where you think you are now investing or looking to use it more from a general perspective, and then maybe we can look at it from a fan safety perspective.
So when it comes again to the organization of the games, those decisions are also closely linked to where the games happen. Yeah, the organizing committees will have also different stance on the use of technology, and this will vary very much quite geographically. What we are looking at, though, of course, technology can be a force for good. We can use it, when we use it well, it can really help, manage impact on violations of people. Yeah, it can help spot, unsafe behavior, discriminatory behavior, so long as, of course, the privacy of people are really well respected. And that's where it's very difficult to manage, because we are in an area where technology is becoming more invasive. Yeah, it's everywhere. Yeah, we are mining data on everyone. We are monetizing this information. We are doing loads of stuff. So it also, and that's why I'm saying it goes back also to the geography and the legislations that are in place in those different countries. For example, in the context of the Tokyo Games and in Asia, facial recognition is something very much already well embedded in the way people actually live and work. Yeah, it was used, and it was used because, again, the legislation around the use of data is pretty strong. It's not the same case in different countries. For example, not to say that the legislation is not strong, but in terms of ethics as well, Paris has decided not to use facial recognition because they were not at ease with this sort of technology. So it is very, very dependent on where you are operating, and again, the safeguard around those issues. Of course, we've just gone through the Beijing Games, where surveillance is a problem. So we are seeing very different challenges when it comes to that. So it's not about being against new technology, but it's about how can we really make sure it serves the right purpose of, in the case, of course, of private security, manage, the crowds in a way that is respectful of their rights, yeah, and as well for the person themselves, yeah, the workers in the private security forces as well. So it's how do you ring fence it so that it doesn't create negative impact.
Okay, that's great. And actually, Remy, you told us a terrible story the other day, wasn't it? A story, a reality, of fans and searches. I mean, that's flagrant abuse of human rights in many cases. So maybe you'd like to share that, I think, with the audience. I think they'd find it interesting.
Yes, we're making a lot of progress on some topics, and as Guido said before, human rights are more and more embedded into the sports. But we've also some worrying trends. Some have to do with post-COVID, some has to do with political choices. I think COVID made a lot of fans realize the importance of the relation they had with the stewards, and the importance that they are protected in their job, and that they can do their job in the best possible condition. When I look at my club, which is not in France, when we returned to the stadium after COVID, I didn't know almost anyone in front of us in the stands, the stewards there. Some stewards have been there for 20, 25 years, and then all of a sudden they were gone. New companies coming in, a huge turnover, and that causes serious organizational and security issues. Obviously, the return to stadium had challenges when it came to fans' behavior, but that wasn't the only factor in. The police forgot how to organize a game properly. Some security officers completely forgot how to do their job. And then, again, this huge turnover in the security sector. So then we realized that we can only be safe. I think a lot of fans, the general public, realize that we can only be safe if stewards can do their job properly, can have the best possible salary, can be trained, and that the job is attractive enough that they remain, that they come every week to the stadium. Now, when it comes to the current trends, what is worrying is, one, this huge turnover. People continue to complain that they don't know the stewards in front of them, that the companies are changing from one week to another, that there is, the quality of the work being performed at the stadium is decreasing. And then there are political choices from the football governing bodies and from the European institutions. When UEFA or the European Union says there's a zero tolerance policy on pyrotechnics, that has direct consequences. And I think this is putting clubs in the private security sector in an impossible situation. Yes, pyrotechnics are illegal in most European countries. Yes, they can be dangerous, but not to the extent that they justify strip searching, searching of cavities, and so on and so forth. But when UEFA or the European Union says zero tolerance policy, what does it mean on the ground? Either clubs or competition organizers have two choices. Either they respect the law, and yes, pyrotechnics will enter the stadium, or they take another route. They go for invasive body searches, and then they will find more pyrotechnics. Not all of them, but they will find more. It's illegal? Yes. But they put in this impossible situation when if they have to deliver, if they want to deliver what is seen as an acceptable event from an organizer's perspective, they have to be in breach of the law. So that's the problem. Most countries in Europe and most sports governing bodies apply an obligation of results, which means a club can do the best job in the world. If pyrotechnics still enter the stadium, they will be fined. Take two examples from my country, France. Two clubs with a completely different approach to safety and security, but the same consequences if pyrotechnics enter the stadium. There's Lyon, probably the best organized club in France and one of the best in Europe when it comes to safety and security, with a good mix of repression and prevention, with a great investment into very capable professionals. They're doing the best possible job in France. And then Marseille. I won't go into details, but that's pretty much the opposite. Yeah? If a pyrotechnic device enters the stadium in Lyon and in Marseille, the fine, whether it is issued by the professional football league in France or UEFA, will be exactly the same. Exactly the same. So there is no incentive into doing a good job, because the result, in the end, from disciplinary perspective, is the same. And just to finish, maybe on a more positive note, there's one country that applied a very interesting solution there, probably the only one that works, is to switch from an obligation of results to an obligation of means. And that's Sweden. In Sweden, if a football club or competition organizer can prove that they've done the utmost within the boundary of the law to avoid pyrotechnics, because that's the example we're taking here, from entering the stadium, they will not be fined. To the opposite, if a club has done a terrible job in preparing the event, in the body searches and so on, they will be fined. And that's where we want to go in as many European countries as possible. We work very close to it, to a change of law in a number of European countries this last few years, and we're really pushing for this, because then you have an incentive, then the competition organizers and the clubs are not pushed by UEFA or by domestic legislation to go too far, and we are better protected. And just to finish on the example that you mentioned earlier, we've had a number of very invasive body searches in the last few months, and we think that's a consequence of the return of the zero tolerance policy on pyro. And those are, unfortunately, are happening in European Union countries and in countries where, as far as we can understand, the private security sector is well regulated. So there's a responsibility from the government, from the competition organizers to ask clubs to have reasonable demands to clubs, so that they don't feel like they have to be in breach of laws.
Excellent, thank you very much. Just conscious of time, never let it be said that Swiss did not stick to time. That would not be the way forward. Any questions from anyone in the audience for anyone on the panel so far? Excellent. I'm not sure we've got anyone to bring a microphone to you. Oh, we do. Excellent. Thank you very much. You wouldn't mind just saying your organisation?
Yeah, Tony Chatton, MSS Global. Really interesting discussion. One area, and Ronan started to allude to it, but I'd like the board to explore slightly more, is the nexus between public security and private security, and the dilemmas and the complications that creates for all parties, including in particular the private security companies, where they're trying to bridge some of the differences in interpretation and obligations?
Great question. Thank you very much. Who would like to take that? Yes.
One very short answer there. Last season, there were 4 European club competitions final, and 2 went really wrong. That's Paris, Saint-Denis, Champions League, and Sevilla, a Europa League. They have one thing in common, is that the police at some point stepped in and changed their safety and security protocol. So there is a refusal in France and in Spain to just let it go, accept that it's a private event, and respect what has been put in place. In Sevilla, the Paris example is very well known, but in Sevilla, something relatively similar happened. After a few minutes of body searches, the police just decided it wasn't good enough and stepped in. And then, had a completely invasive, excessive body searches, throwing away objects that were permitted as per the stadium regulation. So I think there is, in a number of countries, police that, can't accept it's a private event with rules inside the stadium, and just can step in at any moment and change the rules.
Okay, great. I thought I saw another hand. Was there another hand for another question? Excellent. And then there's one over here. That looks like Charlie.
I think we can all agree that there's been quite a lot of bad press around the Qatar event. And I just wondered if that's had any impact on how host nations or host locations will be chosen in the future, and if so, what those are.
Who would like to take that one?
I think I might briefly step in. I think that, the decision-making process goes back to the politics of FIFA, and that's probably a panel discussion on its own. But I think there's definitely more scrutiny on it, and there will be more scrutiny going forward. I think the governing bodies are seeing now how big those decisions are becoming, and the amount of scrutiny that's persevered. I think FIFA probably expected a lot of that to go away as the tournament got closer and got up and running, but it really hasn't. I think the focus and the commercial, I think companies and big multinational companies are becoming more aware of that as well. I think their pressure on those big competition organising those bodies will continue to bring scrutiny. I think you'll see next year the Women's World Cup is on in Australia. I think there'll be big impacts in terms of equality and different issues coming up in that context. Qatar has obviously its own issues in different terms of human rights. But I think those issues will continue to arise in terms of the host nations and in terms of where those things are located. But just to briefly go back on your point about the post-COVID era, Nuala, I think we've noticed a dramatic increase in on-pitch invasions and in-stadium and with supporters or non-supporters entering the pitch and creating dangerous situations. Now, Ronan brought up the issue of pyrotechnics there, but I think there's probably a lot more serious incidents in terms of, don't know if anyone saw the viral video of the Turkish Premier League a few weeks ago, where a fan entered a pitch and attacked the goalkeeper with the corner flag. And I think it's the rise of those kind of violent incidents and the risks that I think we're kind of sleepwalking into, some of the competition organisers. Going back to the technology point you just mentioned, I think that definitely has a big role to play. I think especially in sports and in football, there's a growing role of technology out there now. The players are being asked, their performances are being monitored and scrutinised with technology. Referees are being assisted, the officials are being assisted with more and more technology. So I think it's definitely something that security can be helped with in terms of...
I think you raise a great point. I know the FA, I sit on the board of the FA, I know they're making a huge number of recommendations and to the clubs to put in more stringent penalties, sanctions against the clubs, not just the players, or not just the fans rather, and the supporters who do that. So I know you're right, it'd be an interesting topic even to do that topic by itself. What's making this happen? Why are people suddenly doing it more than before? Because it certainly has increased. Anyone else want to answer that before we go to that chap? Guido? And Megali, sorry.
Sorry, I felt compelled to respond because as a sport, of course, governing body, we also are in our election process for the 2030 Winter Olympic Games. So There's definitely more scrutiny on how we select, the edition of the games. That's for sure. That's not going to go away. And there's more effort from the sports governing bodies to integrate human rights consideration, assessment, a much better understanding right from the onset, and really engage, in a constructive dialogue with the bidding parties to first understand what those risks could be and try to start preempting them so that when you award the games, you already have a kind of a plan. And just to the credit of FIFA, Qatar was done. It was done many, many years ago, but the process they've put in place as well for the elections of the next World Cup in Canada, the US and Mexico, and here Guido will have probably a bit more to say, is quite interesting and fairly well thoroughly done to sort of try and prevent and address that. Going back to the games are universal. Every country or every NOC has a right, to bid for them, and that's not going to go away. What we are going to be doing is really understand much, much better the level of human rights violations that could happen, so that if they were to be awarded the game, we have a very strong plan in place to try and minimize them.
Okay, great. Guido, you wanted to comment as well?
Thank you. Building on the questions and also some of the comments that were made by Michael and Magali. When we started our research on mega sporting events and human rights, and the first report we issued with the Institute for Human Rights and Business that started this journey in 2013, we talked about blurred lines of responsibilities in mega sporting events. And the connection between public and private security is one clear example of the issue at stake. But throughout the life cycle, we see this confusion happening pretty often. And one of the tasks of the center and of our work together with all stakeholders is to better define the roles and responsibilities of each actor. And the connection, yes, between private and public security is one very interesting aspect. Host government agreements following the awarding of Qatar in 2010, we saw that FIFA, the IOC, UEFA, Commonwealth Games Federation, they included human rights considerations linked to awarding a competition. And this is the moment where sport bodies have the highest leverage to promote and influence the agenda of a country and promote human rights. But at the same time, and it is very important to further define what these host agreements mean and how can this be further implemented. I don't think that no one of us wants to have events only in Norway or in Iceland, and of course there are many human rights issues also in Norway and Iceland. So the point is, how can sport help advance the human rights agenda? And we need to do some work, additional research, really to understand all these implications. And one point linked to Qatar. What we did with the Human Rights Volunteers Project is unprecedented. It was the first time that we got access to the venue, to the stadia. We're collaborating with FIFA. We're monitoring what is going on well, where the challenges are. And this is unprecedented set of information, of data that we're collecting, and we will then share as a human rights organization with the rest of the world. And we hope that this model can be further replicated in many other occasions. Next Olympics, next Euro, next big competitions, because there is an ongoing process of knowledge sharing and understanding of the issue that is really the key way to move forward and better understand the issues at stake.
Terrific. Thanks, Guido. We have two more questions that I spotted. Three. That chap, I think you have the mic.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Moi, c'est Frédéric Assongo. Je viens de la RDC. J'ai trois petites préoccupations. La première, le panéliste ont davantage parlé de la sécurité publique et privée, mais très peu ont abordé la question de la sécurité interne. Parce que dans notre pays et dans beaucoup de pays africains, il y a des services de sécurité interne qui sont organisés par le club dans leur stade privé. Comment nous prenons en compte cette catégorie des acteurs? La deuxième, c'est la responsabilité de client. Est-ce que l'évaluation de services et de la demande est bien faite? Comment nous regardons la question? Ou c'est juste une sécurisation symbolique, on demande quelques éléments sans évaluer par rapport à la capacité de stade? Est-ce que nous nous intéressons à, lorsqu'on est en train d'évaluer les failles, les questions de violation, de voir si déjà le service demandé était proportionnel au nombre de personnes qu'il fallait sécuriser? Et peut-être la dernière préoccupation, c'est la protection même des agents de sécurité. Oui, on doit respecter les questions de droits humains, mais comment nous nous assurons que ces agents de sécurité qui opèrent dans un contexte animé, très mouvementé, avec beaucoup d'émotions, sont eux-mêmes sécurisés et leurs droits de travail garantis? Donc, voici un peu mes 3 petites préoccupations.
Thank you very much. Excellent points. And actually, the last one probably hasn't been addressed, protection of the security agents in the field. Anybody would like to take that one? How can we do better? I mean, we could do all 3, but just that last one I don't think has been touched on.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. I think Amnesty International came out with a study on the security workers in the lead up to Qatar, and The Guardian published a story on it as well. And I think they found widespread abuses of their rights in terms of longer working hours than they're meant to, not allocating days off, docking pay if they took their mandatory day off that they're entitled to, and things like that. And I think then that has the knock-on effect of those workers being exhausted, whether physically or mentally, when it comes to asking them to fulfill the policies and procedures that the competition organisers are putting in place, that it's easier for things to slip through the cracks if they're not in the best condition possible to perform their duties. So I think it's really important that's a really important point.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Michael. The chap there.
Okay, Christian Leitz, UBS. I apologize, I arrived late, so maybe it's been addressed, but what's the sort of view and the position of major sponsors and all of that?
That was one of my questions. That's a great point. I had what else could sponsors do? Who'd like to take that? Guido.
Happy to take that. There is one element, which is the element of leverage. Sponsors invest a huge amount of money to sponsor this event, to promote these events, and they play a very important role in exerting leverage and supporting all the actors to make sure that certain criteria and certain standards are respected. So if you look at the sport ecosystem, you see that there are many, many different actors and different ways to exert leverage. There is a political, there is economic leverage. Here we're talking about economic leverage, and if sponsors want to be responsible, want to promote responsible business conduct also in the context of the events they support, well, then they play a very, very important role to make sure that provisions they aim at embedding in their day-to-day work are also embedded and included in the context of the events they are sponsoring. This is one aspect. Just one comment on protection of agents and protection of security people. I think that it is very, very important to understand the rules of engagement. And the earlier this is made, the better, because then people can be trained, people can understand the risks, and people can have the tools and instruments available to address them. One of the worst things that could happen is that private security forces are assigned to a specific task 1-2 days before and don't have the means and the instruments to do the job they're asked for. So it is very, very important to understand what is the service that is requested and what is the service that these people have to provide and what kind of training they have to accomplish this. Very important, on top also of the welfare issues that were raised.
Great.
Nuala, if I can just come in quickly on the commercial aspect, I think that's a really prescient point, and it goes back to the hosting question that came in as well. I think more and more commercial sponsors, you've seen the Budweiser in the lead up to the World Cup have their own issues with FIFA, but I think more and more big commercial sponsors are recognising, I think they'll be disappointed by the FIFA stance on the armband issue at this World Cup. I think the IOC's stance at blocking freedom of expression of athletes at the Tokyo Olympics. I think these issues are becoming bigger and bigger, and athletes' right to freedom of expression and to speak on these social issues, and they've been blocked of doing so, I think has been more and more frowned upon. And I think it will begin to affect the commercial aspects if these organisations don't adapt.
In fairness, I think it's a terrific topic, and it's actually a bigger topic for today than for today. But even as a former sponsor of major sporting events, I think the companies don't do enough. And you know, UBS certainly sponsor a number of different events as well. The big organisations have a voice, and I think not only customers but employees, with all the activism, are now expecting a lot more. And if they don't speak up, I mean, you see CEOs, you know, right, left and centre getting into huge trouble for not speaking up and not having a voice for social injustice. So I think the onus is on them. Even if they don't mean it, they have to do it from a shareholder, customer, employee perspective as well. So I think I think sponsors have a massive responsibility and more power than they think they have in this regard. So I am conscious of time. Do I have time for one more question? One more question? How are we doing, Jamie? You sure? We're not, okay. And then we've got just a final wrap up, 30 seconds each from the panel. Okay, I see 1, 2, 3. Okay, someone has the mic. 2 more.
Liam Kelly from G4S Risk Management. Generally, there is quite a gulf in operating standards and governance standards between those security companies that are not ISO 18788 certified or ICoCA certified memberships. So my question to the panel in reality is, will international sporting bodies going forward demand as part of their supplier selection process that their security providers or the subcontractors are ICoCA certified members?
Remy, do you want to take that one?
On the certification?
Yes, yeah.
Well, in terms of standards, and do we have the companies that are up to the standards, that are able to be certified? That's actually, I think it's a broader issue of having standards aligning at a very high level in private security, but also in sport, and then having the capacity to bring up other actors, other companies, but also other organizers of sporting events up to the right level. We've heard now that they are in the bidding process to the organization, the delivery, and the legacy of an event, of a sporting events. We have now the highest standards for the bigger events that are known, the FIFA World Cup, the Olympics, etc. But there are a number of regional events, of events organized by other federations that may not necessarily yet be up to the standards right now, and we could apply the same to security and private security. I know that there will be the Francophonie Games organized in the DRC next year, and I know that security is one of the concerns that for governments that are going to send delegations to the DRC for the event. So do we have the private security in the DRC that is up to the standards in protecting the venues, ensuring security of supporters, athletes, etc. in the DRC? It's a question mark, and I guess that these question marks, as they apply to extractive companies that are hiring private security companies in complex environments, the same will certainly apply in terms of sporting events. So how do we ensure, and there we have a potential in terms of a margin of improvement, that all events are up to the standards, that all companies are trained and are able to be.
Great, thanks very much, Remy. There's that girl, and then that last chap, and then we'll wrap up for coffee.
Thank you for an interesting panel. My name is Sahana Dharmapuri, and I work on women, peace, and security issues. One of the issues I did not hear your panel speak about is human trafficking. And I understand from some recent analysis by the State Department and others that 66% of global profits from human trafficking happen during major sporting events. So I'm wondering if any of your organizations are discussing how to address human trafficking issues, or if that's an issue that is being raised. Thank you.
That's a great point. And actually, you've reminded me of a different point, which is that apparently during football matches, when England win or lose, that the rate of domestic violence goes up as well. But that's another topic for another day. Anyone would like to take that one on trafficking? Anything? Is that a topic that people are talking about? To the lady's question.
Yeah. Again, I don't claim the IOC has done, has enough data to comment on that. It's certainly something we are aware in certain pockets linked again to organization of the games, such as in the hospitality. I would actually be very interested to access this study that you have mentioned. We know that sporting events do attract, criminal activities linked to them. Again, as Guido said, it's those blurred line of responsibility. Where does our responsibility start and stop when we get to, the IOC, the organizing committee, the subcontractors, then a hotel that would then subcontract, and so on and so on and so forth. That is, where and how can we influence positively to minimize harm. But again, we are aware of that. There's more work to be done to understand exactly the prevalence of human trafficking linked to mega sporting events. And again, what are the measures that we can really realistically use, or the leverage that we can use to sort of minimize that. I don't know, Guido, if there's anything else that you want to comment.
To echo Magali's comment, it would be very, very interesting to see this study and get additional information. In previous events, issues that came up were exploitation of workforce that can be also linked to human trafficking, issues like prostitution, drastically increasing in the context of mega sporting events is something that, for example, we identified in previous studies, but really look forward to having more information. There is an athlete aspect of this as well. So I think that it can be really tackled from various perspectives, and really interesting to further discuss this.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And the last question to the chap behind.
Hi, Edward Martin from Henderson Risk Limited. Last night we saw a dossier leaked from the Met Police of previous officers who had been re-recruited within the police in the UK, who had been charged and even in some cases convicted with various crimes. And it basically shows that even in hyper-regulated public sectors, we can see the wrong people being recruited for jobs where they really shouldn't be. And I wonder if any of your organisations on the panel are working in recruitment in the private security sector to make sure that people who have these risk factors are not put in these positions?
Great question. That's a silent. That was a good one.
Maybe not linked to sport directly, aware of an initiative led by the Institute for Human Rights in Business on responsible recruitment, looking in particular at the dynamics taking place in specific regions around the world, in Southeast Asia in particular. Not really linked to sport, but happy to share some information about this, and this could be an element.
Ronan?
I think one of the biggest challenges in that regard is the presence of organized crime in the security sector in a number of, at least for the countries that I know, in a number of European countries. That has at least one direct effect on the relation with fans, is that when you know that the person in front of you is connected to an organized crime group, they can threaten you. They can threaten you consequences in your private life. They can threaten you to consequences outside the stadium. And this is happening in democracies, in European democracies, so I can imagine the problem is extremely serious.
That's terrific. You have now got 15 minutes left for your coffee. So, and then to the panel, what an amazing panel. On behalf of ICoCA, the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, and I think the audience, I'd like to extend a huge thanks to the panel. Fascinating topic. So, to all of you, Guido, Michael, Ronan, Remy and Magali, massive thanks. Terrific ambassadors for this whole area. We wish you well, and we look forward to your return next year. So, audience and panel, thank you very much.